Welcome to Keith Knight, Don't Tread on Anyone, and the Libertarian Institute. Today, I'm joined by Eric Boehm, a reporter for Reason, and he was also a national regulatory reporter for Watchdog.org. How long ago did you stop doing that?
A while ago. I've been at Reason for a little more than 5 years now, so it's been a minute.
What is the primary cause of the current baby formula shortage in America?
Yeah, well, first of all, Keith, thanks for having me on. Really appreciate the opportunity. And this is, I think, a really important story for lots of Americans, right? I don't have any kids, but I know lots of people who do, who are having all sorts of difficulties finding the baby formula that they need right now. There's a bunch of causes, as with any of these supply chain things, right? It's never just one single thing that you can blame. The most acute cause is there was a problem. The FDA forced an Abbott nutritional plant in Michigan to shut down. It's one of the biggest baby formula manufacturers in the United States. That was back in February. And it was forced to shut down over suspicion that there might have been some tainted formula that came out of there, made some babies sick. So the FDA said, you got to shut it all down. We have to figure out where this came from. That kicked off this chain of events that has led to us having a shortage now, because obviously they haven't been producing formula for months. And so you end up with a gap in the supply chain, and that gap eventually makes its way to grocery stores, and then you don't have formula on the shelves. I think more interesting story here, though, is actually the reason why that gap hasn't been filled in the 3 months since the plant in Michigan was shut down. And that has to do with two things. It has to do with regulatory policy that the federal government has, and it also has to do with trade policy. And these two things kind of work in tandem to keep foreign formula made in Europe, for example, out of the United States market. And Europe is actually the world's largest producer and exporter of baby formula. There are large companies in Europe, a couple in the Netherlands, one in Germany, one in England, that all produce baby formula that's consumed safely by infants all over Europe, all over most of the rest of the world, except it's almost impossible to import that formula into the United States. As I said, there's two reasons for this: regulatory and trade policy. The regulatory reason is that the FDA has rules about what has to be on a label before it can be sold in the United States. And these European companies do not have the FDA's permission to sell in the United States because they have not complied with the FDA's label regulations. It's not that the FDA says this formula is unsafe. In fact, this is literally the formula that the Biden administration is now flying in on military jets from Europe, right, to give to American infants. So it's perfectly safe. There's nothing wrong with it, but it doesn't comply with the label regulations. And we'll come back to that in just a second. The second reason has to do with trade policy. There are very high tariffs, 17.5% tariffs that are applied to imported baby formula. And that is enough to effectively make it uncompetitive. That if you did try to import it into the U.S. market, it would be too expensive, and nobody would buy it, or very few people would buy it under normal circumstances, normal times. So these two things work in tandem. If you are, for example, a baby formula manufacturer in Germany, you have very little incentive to jump through the FDA's hoops to get the appropriate label regulation, right? To get the permission to use your label in America, because even if you did, your product would be tariffed at such a high rate that it would be uncompetitive. So there's no reason to go through the regulatory process and spend the time and money when you're actually going to be shut out of the market anyway. So these other companies just simply don't try to sell here. And we've effectively fenced them out of the U.S. market. And we've done this to protect domestic producers of baby formula and to protect the U.S. dairy industry. And as a result, there's not the flexibility that's necessary so that when a major domestic producer shuts down for a period of months, we don't have the ability to backfill that supply with European baby formula, which would be the ideal solution here, would be to have that come in via the normal trade channels from Europe, not have to be flown in the middle of the night on a military jet, but just let it come in like anything else does. There's plenty of planes and ships that go back and forth between the U.S. and Europe every day that could be bringing baby formula into this country, and they can't do it because of our insane regulatory and trade policies.
So by artificially increasing the price, we have a much lower supply than we otherwise would, which makes the price higher, which means every mother who is buying baby formula is paying much more than she would have to. And, I have trouble believing even people like Josh Hawley who say, well, at least it protects, our foreign or our domestic industries. As much as I like Reason magazine, I don't think it would be in your interest to shut down every other competing agency. I think it would even make you guys worse off. It would make anyone worse off if they didn't face any competition. If
Yeah.
women didn't have the right to divorce their husbands, it wouldn't be to protect the men. It would make everyone worse off who's involved because you're not constantly trying to improve yourself. So I don't believe any of that. When it comes to quotas, this is literally saying an artificial supply. So even if you're saying, you know what, I'll take the higher price in the form of a tariff, I hear that there's quotas on baby formula. Is that accurate?
That's right. These things, the tariff that is on baby formula is called a tariff rate quota. It's a little bit complicated. It is a tariff that functions effectively as a quota. So it is set at a level where it is determined that it would make it effectively uncompetitive and uneconomical for a foreign supplier to send their goods into the United States. So it's not an absolute quota. For example, I just wrote a piece today about steel and South Korean steel, which is subject now, thanks to the Trump administration, to an absolute quota. There is a limit. It's about 2.5 million metric tons of steel that South Korea is allowed to send in the United States every year, and they cannot exceed that level. It's a hard quota. This is a little different than that. It's a tariff. It's a tax that is applied to imports, but it is meant to function effectively as a quota system so that it effectively shuts out any foreign supply. When we're talking about baby formula, 98% of the baby formula that is consumed in the United States, that's sold and consumed in the United States, is also produced in the United States. So these policies that we were just talking about, the trade and regulatory policies, have been very effective at shutting out foreign supply. 98% domestic supply. You mentioned Josh Hawley. This is what he wants for everything. He wrote an op-ed in the New York Times last year arguing that we should have stricter Made in America rules, not just for government procurement, but actually for the entire market. You know, that his idea, and people who think like him, and there's too many of them out there these days, who think that domestic trade, or that foreign trade and having suppliers in foreign countries makes the United States somehow vulnerable to supply shocks, when it's actually the exact opposite. I think this whole situation with baby formula proves exactly why you have to have a diverse set of supplies for any good, because you could have a supply shock that originates in China or somewhere else in the world. You could have a supply shock that originates in Michigan in the United States. And if you don't have the ability for markets to adjust to that changing supply, then you're going to end up in a situation where you have shortages, where you have price controls have to be applied, where you have other sorts of mechanisms that are obviously less than ideal.
You say in this article, those 25% tariffs were imposed by the Trump administration in 2018 as part of an overall rising of tariffs on nearly all imported steel and aluminum. So steel being something that is not just, hey, when I go and pick up some steel to work in the garage, everything in the production process consists of steel. Like everything you're currently sitting on, talking into, or working with involves steel in the production process. It's one of these things that we don't realize how terrible the situation is until we're really forced to look at the details. Absolutely incredible. Let's look at the case of, I'm sorry, did you have anything else on that?
No, I think that's a great point. I think downstream industries have been destroyed by those steel and aluminum tariffs, and I think that's the other thing that protectionists and the nationalists sort of, they don't see, right? They think, well, we need to protect our steel industry, and you don't think about the fact that I forget exactly what the number is. I think it's 11 times as many jobs are downstream of the steel industry as actually in the steel production industry. Mm-hmm. And you're hurting all those jobs with those tariffs to protect a select few. And that's the mistake. That's what they don't see. That's the trade-off.
What is the primary cause of high gas prices in America?
That's probably a bit more complicated of a question even than the baby formula one, which is, obviously quite complex. Gasoline prices are high because of a variety of reasons. There's obviously the war, Russian war in Ukraine, that is affecting things. I think, again, you can't discount regulatory policy there either. The fact that we've made it harder to maintain and open new refineries in the United States, so we have less of a domestic ability to take crude oil and turn it into gasoline. This is a case kind of the opposite of the baby formula thing, where we are more reliant on other countries because we've regulated out our own domestic industry. And so you see kind of on both hands where this can be a mistake, right? Being overly reliant on yourself can be a mistake. Trying to be as reliant as possible on other countries, so you don't have to have a dirty refinery in the United States, can also be a mistake. Obviously, that sort of regulatory environment that we've created in this country taps down on the desire to invest in the sort of infrastructure that's necessary to continue to produce gasoline. And so I think that's absolutely a factor. That's not something that's causing an acute spike right now, but it's the sort of thing that is exposed when you do have a spike in prices, when there would normally be a rush to increase supply. You notice these supply constraints more obviously than you would if gas was still $1.50 a gallon. So there's obviously a number of factors there. But you can't discount inflation, just general inflation in the economy too, and the fact that the money that was spent during the COVID pandemic in particular has contributed to that. And so prices are up across the board, and that means gasoline is going to be more expensive too. It's certainly not immune to those spikes. If anything, it's probably more affected by inflation than some other goods are.
And what would you say is the primary cause of inflation, assuming we're using the definition as a rise in the general price of consumer products instead of an increase in the money supply? Because then obviously we're just putting it on the Federal Reserve's monopoly.
Sure.
But if you had to explain why we're seeing this drastic increase in the price of everyday goods and services, what causes inflation?
Well, I think we're seeing an increase in goods and services around the world, right? The whole world is experiencing a period of higher prices right now and inflation. But what's interesting is that the United States is seeing relatively higher inflation than the rest of the world is, even during a time period when the rest of the world is going through high inflation too. And so you have to look at what's the unique circumstance to the United States that would create uniquely high inflation here, higher than Europe is experiencing, or higher than China or Japan are experiencing. And I think you have to look at the response during the pandemic. You have to look at this as partially the Federal Reserve, but it's also partially the decision of Congress and two different presidential administrations. But I think most importantly, the one that was passed during the Biden administration in March of last year, the American Rescue Plan, that dumped $1.9 trillion into the economy through various mechanisms, some of it through direct checks to Americans. And that was a bill, that was a spending plan that was criticized even by economists on the left. Larry Summers, who was one of the top economists in the Obama White House, was on the record in the Washington Post weeks before that bill passed saying this is going to cause inflation. Like he was not being, quiet or secretive, or this was not something that was coming out in, whispers from anonymous sources in DC media. This is something where economists, well-known economists on right and left, were, shouting it in the pages of the New York Times and the Washington Post. This bill will cause inflation. And Congress didn't listen. The White House didn't listen. They passed the bill, and lo and behold, here it is. We have higher inflation.
When you look at healthcare prices, there was just, a picture going around from this woman. Here is my mother's receipt from 1956. And it listed every single thing. And the total for a baby delivery was like $100, including a 4-night stay in a hotel. Now, for all I know, she faked that. The point is, we do know there's been a drastic increase since the 50s. This is before Medicare, Medicaid, FDA expansion, ACA.
Sure.
But what would you say is the primary cause of high gas prices, considering it's always pinned on the voluntary sector?
You mean healthcare? Healthcare prices?
Healthcare prices.
I think it's the fact that the word price really doesn't even apply in the healthcare setting anymore, right? What we've done is through layers of insurance and layers of government programs, we've actually divorced the end consumer, the patient, from any sort of understanding of what the actual price of the service they're receiving is. And everybody along that chain, nobody knows what anything costs. The doctor doesn't know, the nurse doesn't know. So, you're talking about going in and having a baby. That obviously involves a whole bunch of different steps, different care being given by different parties through that whole thing. But nobody in there has any idea what those things actually cost. And nobody in there has any incentive to keep the costs down. In fact, if anything, they have an incentive to go the other direction. So it's more than anything else. And we could spend, you could spend hours, you could write books about like the way healthcare costs have increased in the last 5 decades. But I would say the number one most important thing is just the divorcing of any sort of market mechanism, any sort of price signal from the healthcare system. And the price signals do a very good job of encouraging people to either to consume more, to consume less, or to consume this instead of consuming that, or to make this choice instead of that choice. And we do that every day with every decision we make regarding services and goods that we buy. But when you go to the doctor, there's none of that. You have no idea what anything costs. You pay a copay maybe to your insurance, or maybe you even don't do that, and you don't understand it. Nobody understands it, and nobody has any incentive to keep the costs down.
Do you have about 5 more minutes?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you so much for being generous with your time. I came
Good
across
conversation.
this article from Cato. It says private
Yeah.
regulation, a real alternative for regulatory reform. And they say the original meaning of regulate, as in the constitutional authorization to regulate interstate commerce, was to make regular. In this sense, regulations provide customers information and help people make informed decisions so that they can protect themselves from dubious products. When
Yeah.
you read that, is there anything you hear that says this needs to be something that could only be done by the state, or can this be something brought into the voluntary sector?
I think it depends on what you're talking about, and I think that some of that is going to be defined or decided by kind of the emerging choices that the people in that market would make, right? So I think we should bring this back, maybe talk about baby formula, right? There's certainly an ideal libertarian world in which we would say, well, we don't need any sort of regulation whatsoever. Consumers will figure out what they want to feed their babies and what's good and what's bad. I think in the real world, I think people, parents in particular, who are feeding infants are going to want some level of understanding of what it is that they're getting, and some level of certification from experts saying this is healthy and good for your baby and this isn't. That doesn't have to come from government. Obviously, you could certainly imagine private organizations that are capable of doing that sort of testing, and you might have a variety of products on the store shelves, and this one is certified by organization ABC, and they say, we're a private organization and we say this is good for your baby, and there might be another one that's certified by a different organization, right? You can imagine all of that. That thought experiment totally works. In the real world, the FDA fulfills those functions, like it or not, and we don't like it often. But I think the structure and the important thing for libertarians to argue about is where those regulations are placed and how they are applied. And so when you have a situation like the one we have right now, where the FDA is, for reasons that frankly don't make any sense, saying you can't have baby formula that the European regulators recognize as good and fine and safe for your baby, you can't import that just because it doesn't fit with our labeling rules. Like, obviously that's a regulation that goes beyond the sort of health and safety concerns that is the reason why we create that government agency in the first place. So I think the first step would be, and this is sort of a form of private regulation, like we were just talking about, with different regulators, approving different products. I think one of the first reforms that should come out of this baby formula shortage is that we should say any product that is approved by a regulator that we recognize as being legit. So the European Union or Canada, Great Britain, their health regulators, if their health agencies say this product is safe, it should be legal to be sold here, even if the FDA disagrees. And that's not private because they're all government agencies, right? But there's some competition then created among regulators, so that if an American consumer wants to buy a product that's been approved by a European regulator, they should be free to make that choice.
What would you say is your elevator pitch to the average nationalist or conservative who says it is important that we have the state protecting domestic industries from foreign competition because, as it's sometimes called, industrial unilateral disarmament if countries engage in any free trade policy? What do you say to that mindset?
I would say that mindset is completely incorrect. There are strategic advantages that the United States has. There are strategic advantages that other countries have, and the market will figure out which of those things is going to work best, right? And that the United States, I think the whole notion of the idea that we need to protect our domestic manufacturers is misguided to begin with. If you look at manufacturing capacity in the United States, it's gone up for the last 30 to 40 years. It's not falling. We're not in danger of losing our manufacturing base here. So I think they're arguing from faulty precepts. I think they're arguing on bad faith more often than not. And I think consequentially, I think the baby formula shortage shows very clearly one of the real dangers of that sort of system. This is exactly the system that the nationalists want. They want us to be completely dependent and completely self-reliant, as they say, which really just means completely dependent on domestic supply. That's what we are. 98% of the baby formula that's consumed in the United States is made in the United States. And yet we have this massive shortage because of protectionism, because of bad regulations. This is their system. They should own this failure.
Final question. What do you say to the progressive mindset that says this sort of free trade policy just sort of allows the biggest people, the biggest players in the market to just go anywhere they want and just make money, whereas protectionism would help the workers stay in power and give them more leverage against the bourgeoisie?
Yeah. I don't know. Has that ever worked out, right? I'd love for them to give me a test case of when that's happened. Capital is always liquid. It's always going to move around. It's always going to flow to the lowest point, right? So the extent to which you can capture capital markets with regulations is, I mean, I don't know. It's just a fiction that you can even accomplish something by doing that. So again, I think that's a bad premise, and it's argued oftentimes in bad faith. And these things, in both cases, both left and right, they make these arguments for explicitly political reasons. They're trying to appeal to a certain segment of voters. They're trying to get elected into office. So to some extent, these aren't really even economic arguments. They're actually political arguments. They're actually, vote for me because I support you, and I'll do things that at least sound like they will help you, even if they won't. Free markets allow people to buy, the best goods at the lowest prices, and have access to not just always goods and prices, but to have access to a large amount of supply, to have choice. When you walk into an American supermarket, except for right now, you have, overwhelming choice in your supply, and everybody should have that opportunity with every purchase they make. And that's, we can't try to draw lines around that and say this is good and this is bad. Let the consumers have the final say.
Links will be in the description below. Check out Eric Boehm at reason.com. Well, what I love about this approach is that it really lets people know that we are the philosophy of caring about the everyday person, about the consumers, about the poorest among us, just as when the progressive might say, well, if you need a license to vote, the people with the least amount of resources won't be able to access voting.
Yeah.
Well, when you have 10,000 licenses to open up a barber shop, well, it's not exactly like Jeff Bezos is crying in the corner, devastated. Oh, no, more licensing. Of course, they're able to comply with it. Eric Boehm, thank you so much for your time, sir. Links in the description below. Thanks to everyone for watching the Libertarian Institute. Appreciate it, Eric.
Thanks a lot, Keith.